Hey everybody, Paul Collier back here. So we're talking about the next piece of your theory of change today, and I think this is the most fun aspect of it. Today we'll be talking about really identifying the outcomes your organization is orienting around and how your activities, how your day-to-day work links to those outcomes. This is really sort of the meat of your theory of change, if you will. It can be maybe the conceptually most challenging part and also, I think, the funnest part. So let's talk a little bit about why doing this is so critical. So if you can really get your outcomes right in your theory of change, this is the foundation for all of your evaluation and impact measurement work. And if you're not clear about your outcomes, it can be really challenging to figure out, okay, well, what data do we focus on even collecting? So get this part of your impact measurement strategy right. You can have more consistent reporting metrics. And also, it allows you to understand what of the different activities you do on a day to day basis best influence the outcomes you're trying to achieve. So ultimately, you can make the very best use of your time and your organization's money. So, as a reminder, here's the big picture of your theory of change. And we've already talked about target population and problem statement. We've actually touched on long term outcomes. So, now we'll be talking about this middle section here: activities, outputs, and shorter term outcomes. So, activities, really basic. This is what you do. And in your theory of change, you can use different language as some of the other parts we've talked about. You can use the term strategies, you can use the term programs. I would encourage you to write your activities in a way that would be coherent for somebody who isn't really familiar with all of your programs and all of the nuts and bolts. So what don't you do? Try and avoid using a program name that isn't particularly descriptive. Just say what your organization actually does. So could be things like providing training or education, convening or facilitation, providing referrals, advocacy and policy influence work. And there's a lot of nuance under each of these that you can choose to add if you want to, public awareness campaigns, and so on. So activities are just what you do as an organization. Try and use very simple, concrete language that folks can latch onto outside of your organization, even if they're not familiar with your work in here. So the outputs are the collection, are the counts of what you do. These are sometimes known as metrics or indicators of participation and engagement. And when we're talking about metrics, there's an important distinction between output indicators and outcome indicators. So we'll get to the outcome indicators in a second. Outputs, just think about these as the direct products of what you do. So if your activity is providing training or education, an output would be the number of training participants. It's the scale of engagement. If your activity is around providing referrals, your output might be number of referrals provided, the types of those referrals, that sort of thing. So conceptually, keep in mind that outputs are numbers describing the scale of what you do, and outcomes describe the meaningful change based on that participation. So within this, we're not really talking about life change yet. Outputs generally will just describe who has engaged with us and how. So now let's get into outcomes. So outcomes are the meaningful results of what you do. So in your theory of change, you'll want to describe your outcomes. These are directional changes for individuals in knowledge, skills, attitudes, aspirations, behaviors, or conditions. They can also be defined for an entity or for a family or for an organization. And we'll talk about what that might look like here in a second. But just keep in mind that outcomes don't have to be only for individuals, though often we describe them for individuals, at least to start. So if we're looking across this chain here, so we talked about, providing training or education as a common activity. A common output for that might be the number of training participants and the type of those participants. A common outcome for that sort of work would be increased knowledge around that particular topic. So if we're thinking about providing referrals, for example, outputs, number of referrals provided, outcomes might be that person actually engaged in these relevant other services. You know that they took a step to connect with this other organization. One last example. So public awareness campaigns. We're going to run some public awareness campaigns to change attitudes about an issue. An output might be the number of impressions. Where these impressions happen? The number of unique people that saw this thing. The outcome that we're aiming to achieve is some kind of change in public attitude, maybe even a change in behavior as a result of that change in attitude. So I hope that that distinction makes sense. This division between outputs and outcomes is really important because for many years, nonprofits were asked really to report on their outputs, the scale, especially by government entities, without any consideration for are there meaningful positive changes happening for individuals, happening for communities as a result of those. So now I think it's very common that any funder, any organization contracting with a nonprofit asks you to report both outputs and outcomes. So let's get into some of the nuances of outcomes and what makes them just so fun. So the first is that outcomes tend to exist on a relative timescale. So every organization will be trying to influence some shorter term outcomes, things that'll change relatively soon after engaging with a person, and then trying to engage in also some longer term outcomes, things that will happen further down the road as a result of their participation with your organization. And so this time scale, what is shorter term, what is longer term, varies. For every single organization, it's different. So some organizations might be working towards 50-year, 75-year long-term outcomes, changes that happen over the course of generations. Other organizations might be thinking, if we can change something 6 months or 12 months in the future for an individual, that's as long-term as we get, as long-term as we as our organization cares. So there's no right or wrong answer here. Just keep in mind there is a distinction, and it's helpful to consider what are our short-term outcomes, what are our medium-term outcomes, what are our longer-term outcomes. Some of the common differences in here. Often shorter-term outcomes will explore maybe changes of feeling, attitude, maybe changes in satisfaction or trust. So perceptions potentially. And then your medium-term and longer-term outcomes may be more related to changes in behavior or changes in major aspects of a person's status or condition as a result of sustained behaviors over time. Another important nuance here is when you're starting out trying to measure your impact, you generally start by measuring your impact on your shorter term outcomes. Because if you've thought about how your short term outcomes influence and contribute to the medium term and those influence and contribute to the longer term, if you don't see any evidence for the shorter term outcomes happening, you know that your theory of change isn't working as intended. It's generally easier to measure change in short-term outcomes, and it can still be very valuable as a starting place. Organizations that seek to measure longer-term and medium-term outcomes need to have some evidence that your shorter-term outcomes are actually happening before it makes any sense to do the more intensive, sometimes more challenging data collection that is associated with measuring medium-term and longer-term outcomes. So hopefully that timescale makes sense. One other aspect of your outcomes that you want to keep in mind is, what level of society, if we will, are these showing up at? So this diagram is called the socio-ecological model, comes from the fields of sociology, commonly known in macro practice social work. This essentially says that individuals are situated within a web of interpersonal relationships. Those relationships are situated within institutions, and those institutions are situated within community and society. And so there are these different levels of social organization that exist all around us, and we're all part of them. And outcomes can happen at each of these different levels. So, we've been talking a lot about individual outcomes, changes in knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviors, that sort of thing. There can be outcomes at the interpersonal level too. For example, if we're working with families, these could be changes in family dynamics, newer altered relationships, reduced conflict between individuals in a family or in an organization, that sort of thing. So here we're talking about outcomes between two individuals. Then for institutions, we might be talking about outcomes for that entire institution. So changes within an organization or government agency around the policies they follow, the strategy they pursue, their budgeting approach, the processes through which they do their regular work. This could be institutional changes. And then finally, at the community level, these could include changes in funding, how money flows across the community, how other resources flow across the community. Policy changes are commonly talked about, and these are sort of changes in the rules by which community and society operates. You could be talking about changes in power structures, different collaborations between significant actors, change social norms. So as you can see, there's a lot of potential outcomes at each of these levels. You just want to think, okay, maybe some of the outcomes we're thinking about, maybe they are at the individual level, but we're actually also seeking some institutional level changes. Let's get specific about some of those. Okay, one more resource as you're thinking about what outcomes your organization is working towards. This is called the Fogg Behavior Grid. And so what BJ Fogg did with this was he said, okay, often we're working towards change behaviors, but let's break that down a little bit. So, when we're talking about behavior change, we could be asking somebody to do a new unfamiliar behavior. This is the green column. We could be asking somebody to do a familiar behavior. That's a blue column. Increase the likelihood or increase the intensity of a behavior. So that's the purple column. Decrease the intensity of a behavior they're already doing. So that's gray. And then black, stop doing a behavior. So there are these different flavors of behavior change, from doing something new that's unfamiliar to doing something familiar more often, less often, etc. And then he also categorized this by, do we want a person to just do a behavior once? Do we want them to do it over a set duration, like, change my actions for a month? Or do we want somebody to create a new habit, a behavior that's done from now on, a lasting change? And there's sort of like an intersection between all these things. So just read a couple of these, for example. So what is a new unfamiliar behavior done one time? Install solar panels on your house. We're trying to get people to install solar panels. They do it once, that's done. What if we want folks to stop a behavior? We want it to go from now on. Maybe never litter again. That could be an example of that kind of stopping a behavior and making that avoidance of that behavior a habit. So you can read through this and see all kinds of really useful examples of different kinds of behavior change. So I want to introduce this when we're thinking, oh yeah, we do want to change behaviors. What do we really mean by it? Let's try and get more specific about what we are looking for when we say behavior change. Okay, so I've given you all kinds of things to think about in terms of brainstorming outcomes. Let's look at an example here. So I'm using the example of Objective Zero. This is my former client, the organization that provides peer support for veterans through a mobile app. So we talked about your mission, problem statement, target population in our prior example. So let's get into their actual theory of change diagram. So it looks like this. And here you can see they've adopted the logic model framework or logic model template to organize this visually. And so you can see they have activities, they have outputs, they have outcomes, and then longer term impact. So as you're looking at this, for example, one of their activities is we're building and maintaining partnerships with other veteran serving organizations to get resources and support. This is contributing to the number of community members that we're ultimately reaching through virtual in-person events and engagements. All of these things contribute to their shorter term outcomes, which includes increased community awareness of veteran suicide, belief that resources will help, etc. So that's how you read this thing across. Note their time scale. So their longest term outcomes are actually just 2+ year outcomes for individuals. And then we sort of back up into shorter term outcomes, 0 to 3 months after starting to use this out, 3 to 6 months, 6+ months from there. So let's zoom in on these outcomes and just kind of look at some of the things that they did here. So in their shorter term outcomes, here's some of the things they named, increase awareness of suicide, awareness of mental health and wellness resources, belief that those resources will help, belief that the app is safe. So here in their short-term outcomes, we're kind of they're focusing more on changes in knowledge and attitudes. And you can also read some of these things as prerequisites for some of these longer-term changes. So if we want them to actually continue using the app, they need to believe that this thing is safe, that this thing is private, that it will help. So those are our short-term outcomes in this example. In their medium-term outcomes, they've listed things like an increased sense of well-being, use of relevant resources after 3 to 6 months. Their ambassadors, the folks who are connecting with peers, are also aware of more mental health and wellness resources. Feeling a greater sense of community, feeling less stigma, less barriers to receiving care, for example. So some things I would notice in here, they name outcomes for 2 fairly distinct groups. These are the folks who are seeking peer support on the app and also folks who are providing it. So they name outcomes for both. And they're also naming both changes in attitudes, around sense of well-being, but also some first-time behaviors. So if we're going back to that sort of that fog behavior grid, these are some of the green behaviors. We're actually using some of these relevant resources for the first time. So we knew about them here, but now we're actually starting to use them. That's our intention, at least. And then long-term outcomes. So here we're naming things like, increase user-applied wellness skills, decrease suicidal risk, decrease burden on crisis response systems. So some of the things named in here include repeated behaviors. So somebody has actually built up a habit. They've been able to sustain their wellness over time through the new tools that they've learned, the new organizations they've connected with, and the new habits that they have created. And then we're also tying our long-term outcomes back to that problem statement. So when we talked in our problem statement, we said, really, like veteran suicide is a huge challenge. We're hoping our long-term outcome, at least, is that there is lower suicidal risk for the folks who are using this app after having been on that app for a number of months. So hopefully that illustrates, that kind of ties some of these concepts together. When you're working on this, I encourage you to check out this example meeting agenda that I've got. It's a great resource for really structuring the outcomes activity and the discussion among your team. And also, take a look at this self-grading rubric. So especially here under the content section, we're now addressing really most of the aspects of the content in our theory of change. So you want to make sure that you're hitting all of these points. So that's all I've got for you today. Go forth, work on your outcomes. And good luck. This is the funnest part, maybe the most challenging part of your theory of change, but you get this done and you're probably 75% of the way to having all of the concepts addressed that you really want to address here. So go forth, make it happen, and I'll catch you here in another few minutes for my next video.